Marcus, I'm sorry, but your contract won't be renewed. That's all it took. One sentence, spoken without malice, but entirely without weight. 22 years of loyalty collapsed into a single breath and a folder pushed across the desk. My name is Marcus Reed, 51 years old. For over 2 decades, I served as the lead facilities technician at Rivergate Medical Systems in Dallas, Texas. You wouldn't find my name on a plaque or hear it at board meetings. I wasn't the one cutting ribbons or shaking hands with donors. I was the guy in the boiler room at 3 a.m. patching leaks so surgeries didn't have to be canceled. I was the one climbing rooftop units in 110-degree heat to make sure newborns in the NICU didn't suffocate in a system failure. But none of that mattered. Across from me sat the hospital's operations director, Philip Caldwell, slick suit, practiced expression, the kind of guy who never broke a sweat even during a fire drill. Next to him was a young HR associate, probably fresh out of college, nervously clutching a clipboard like it was a shield. "I understand," I said, quietly, standing up before they could offer condolences they didn't mean. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to argue. That wasn't my way. I gathered my things, my thermos, the broken wristwatch my son gave me years ago, and a folder of old schematics I'd hand-drawn when our digital records kept crashing. Outside the office, the hallway buzzed with normalcy. Nurses called out vitals, pagers beeped, carts rolled past. People I'd worked beside for years offered awkward nods or looked away. I didn't take it personally. Most had no idea the systems they relied on ran because of someone like me. At the loading dock, I handed in my badge. The security guard barely looked up. I turned back for a final glance at the building where I'd spent half my life. The glass doors reflected the morning sun, just like they did every day. Only this time, I was on the outside. No one came to say goodbye. No thank you. No, nothing. But deep down, I wasn't shocked. I'd seen it coming. The consultant they hired last year, Griggs, the one with no mechanical experience but a LinkedIn page that screamed optimization, had been making changes, cutting corners, ignoring inspection schedules. I didn't speak up then. I figured maybe I was just old-fashioned. But now, walking to my truck, I felt something cold settle in my chest. It wasn't sadness. It was something sharper, something focused. They thought they were done with me, but they'd just made the worst mistake of their lives. They didn't escort me out. They didn't need to. I walked down the same corridor where I'd spent the better part of 22 years making sure the lights stayed on and the floors didn't flood. My boots echoed across the linoleum, each step heavier than the last. Past the pediatric ward where I'd once installed emergency lighting during a blackout. Past the maternity unit where the heating system had failed during a January freeze and I'd worked through the night so no newborns went cold. And no one looked up. Nurses I'd fetched coffee for during double shifts. Surgeons who'd nodded their thanks after I fixed operating room HVAC in the dead of night. Maintenance techs who once shadowed me to learn how to read blueprints. They all kept their heads down, eyes glued to monitors, fingers clicking over keyboards. It was like I'd become invisible in real time. I reached the locker room. My nameplate was already gone. The lock had been clipped, contents bagged and tagged like lost property. My favorite wrench, the one I'd engraved with my initials in '07, was gone. So was the photo of Andrea and our boys from the 4th of July cookout, the one taped to the inside door for more than a decade. Like they'd been waiting for this. That's when the truth hit me. They had been. It all started 6 months ago, when Richard Bannister, our new CEO, brought in consultants to modernize hospital operations. The ringleader was Chase Langford, a 30-something with a tailored suit, shiny loafers, and absolutely no idea what thermal recovery valves were. He threw around buzzwords like efficiency audits and automation integration like they were sacred texts. Real smooth talker. To the board, he sounded like the future. To people like me, he sounded like trouble. Langford never asked how the systems worked. He asked why they cost so much. Why were we still using preventative maintenance logs when a software could track repairs? Why were 2 senior technicians still on payroll when a mobile app could handle most of it? He didn't know that software doesn't stop a water main burst at 2 a.m. Didn't care either. I kept my head down. Let him talk. Let him tour my workshop and take notes on a clipboard he didn't understand. But I started to notice things. Like how I was no longer copied on interdepartmental work orders. Like how emergency response drills suddenly didn't include facilities. And how new hires were being placed without my input. Kids who barely knew which end of a plunger to hold, walking around with titles like Junior Infrastructure Analyst. I tried to talk to Caldwell, the director of operations. "Marcus," he said with that practiced corporate smile, "we're transitioning to a leaner model, but we value your legacy here." Legacy. That's what they call it when they've already written your obituary but haven't printed it yet. I wasn't naive. I knew I was being phased out. What burned wasn't the layoff. It was the silence, the complicity, the way nobody stood up. Not Beth in accounting, whose frozen pipes I fixed one Thanksgiving morning. Not Dr. Simmons, who once paged me personally when her OR suction line failed and I had it running in 10 minutes flat. Not even Ray, the young tech I trained from scratch, who now sat in my old seat. That sting, that quiet betrayal, was the worst part. Not being fired, being forgotten. I drove home that day in a daze. The house was empty. Andrea was visiting her sister in Austin. I dropped the box on the kitchen table and just stared at it. A bunch of loose ends, a thermos, a bent screwdriver, a 22-year career packed into a square foot of cardboard. I poured myself a coffee and sat in my garage workshop. Dusty tools, old blueprints, and silence. The kind of silence that hums, the kind that dares you to do something with it. I wasn't sure what yet, but I knew this. Rivergate thought they'd tossed away a janitor with a key ring. What they actually discarded was the only person who understood the building's bones. And that gave me more leverage than they could possibly imagine. The silence at home wasn't the comforting kind. It was the kind that presses in on you, thick and heavy, like insulation stuffed inside your ribs. Andrea didn't say much at first. She just sat beside me in the garage, watching as I flipped through old notebooks and scrolled through years of digital records. Every squeak of the office chair, every hum of the heater felt louder in that quiet. She finally broke it. "You didn't deserve that," she said softly. "You gave them everything." I didn't respond right away. I was staring at the screen, but my mind was rewinding through time. 22 years of emergencies, of holding the hospital together with grit and duct tape. I thought about every time I'd patched failing circuits during Christmas dinner, or crawled under a burst pipe in January while my kids opened gifts without me. They didn't just take my job. They made a joke of my loyalty. And then, between archived checklists and annotated blueprints, I found something I hadn't been looking for. I was combing through the maintenance logs from the oncology wing, an area with tight temperature tolerances for medication storage, when I saw the first red flag. The cooling unit was flagged Serviced and Verified 0218, signed off by C. Griggs. I knew for a fact that unit had failed 2 days later. I'd fixed it myself. No service had been done before that. I kept digging. The further back I looked, the more C. Griggs I found. Same name, same rubber stamp,
but all on reports I either handled myself or knew for a fact were never completed. Equipment that hadn't been serviced, outages that were never logged, fire door tests marked passed even though I remembered rewiring the sensor the week after they were supposedly certified. All signed off by Chase Griggs. I felt the heat rise in my chest, not just anger, but betrayal of a different kind. Bannister hadn't just forced me out for modernization. He'd brought in someone who was actively falsifying safety records, someone who was putting patients and staff at risk for the sake of performance metrics. I opened another folder, Compliance Backups, and compared the original logs I kept for myself to what the hospital submitted during quarterly audits. They didn't match. Someone had gone in and edited the digital copies. Time-stamped logs were overwritten. In one case, fire suppression inspections had been duplicated across multiple departments using identical language, word for word. Lazy forgery, sloppy fraud. It wasn't just one incident. It was systemic, and it was sanctioned. Because Chase Griggs wasn't just a consultant. He was a cover-up artist. I closed the laptop, breathing hard. Andrea looked at me with quiet intensity. "What is it?" "I think I found something. Bad? Worse than bad." That night, I barely slept. My mind spun with possibilities, questions, what-ifs. Should I send it anonymously? Would anyone believe me? Would they bury it? I knew what kind of legal machine Rivergate had behind it. I also knew the hospital was in line for a lucrative expansion grant, contingent on perfect compliance scores. A scandal like this could cost millions. But I wasn't thinking about money. I was thinking about the patients. The mother in room 212 whose oxygen alarm once failed because a sensor had been left uncalibrated for 6 months. The premature twins in NICU whose incubators had been rewired with temporary power lines during a system upgrade. The elderly man whose fall went undetected because the hallway monitor glitched and never logged his movement. These weren't numbers. These were lives. And someone was cutting corners with them. That's when the decision became simple. I wasn't going to walk away. I was going to walk back in. Not with a badge, not with a wrench, but with something much more dangerous. Proof. The next morning, I copied everything onto a secure drive, backups of backups. I created encrypted folders, cloud redundancies, and emailed one version to a secure Proton Mail account I set up years ago in case of a ransomware attack. I wasn't just a janitor, I was a systems guy too, and I knew how to protect data that mattered. I printed 3 key reports: the falsified compliance records, the metadata logs showing tampering, and an email chain.
By the time the state inspectors arrived, I was already 5 steps ahead. The anonymous complaint I filed with the Texas State Safety Commission wasn't just a tip, it was a blueprint for a full-scale audit. I had marked every manipulated entry, attached time-stamped screenshots, and included metadata chains that couldn't be dismissed as clerical errors. I knew what would catch their attention. The NICU fire suppression system that hadn't passed inspection in over 14 months but had a pristine digital record thanks to Chase Griggs. But I didn't stop there. A week before the inspection began, I called Dana Liang, a journalist I had followed for years. She'd once taken down an entire hospital administration after exposing Medicare fraud and unsafe dialysis conditions. Her articles didn't just report, they triggered policy changes. I reached out using a secure email with a simple subject line: "Patient lives at risk, Rivergate." She replied within 2 hours. We met in a small diner on the outskirts of town. I brought printed documents, 2 flash drives, and a burner phone. When she saw what I laid out, she didn't speak for nearly a minute. Then she looked up at me with quiet disbelief. "Are you saying they've been faking safety inspections in the pediatric wing?"
I nodded. NICU, oncology, elder care, they covered every high-risk unit. And all the signatures? Griggs. She tapped her pen against the edge of the table. Do you know how many grants Rivergate received last year tied to their safety ratings? Over 6 million. I pulled the tax filings. Dana exhaled slowly. Okay. We do this smart. Quiet first, then public. We coordinated timelines. I agreed not to speak to anyone else. She promised to keep my identity confidential unless absolutely necessary. Over the next 2 weeks, we exchanged encrypted updates while Rivergate slowly began to unravel. It started with whispers, staff being pulled into closed-door meetings, IT systems experiencing unplanned maintenance, and Griggs mysteriously going on family leave. But then came the hammer. The state inspectors, armed with my evidence, walked through the halls like federal agents. I watched it all unfold from my living room, live-streamed by Dana's crew. Inspectors opening sealed cabinets, pulling equipment logs, testing emergency lights that flickered after 2 seconds. And then the bomb dropped. Dana published her expose. Inside Rivergate, a culture of compliance or a culture of concealment. She didn't name me, but she didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. The article detailed how forged inspection logs were linked to patient-endangering malfunctions, how Chase Griggs was hired without full background vetting, and how the hospital board had ignored 2 prior internal complaints about safety shortcuts. She included a whistleblower quote. They thought because I wore a janitor's badge I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew everything. By the following Monday, Rivergate's executive team issued a statement saying they welcomed the opportunity to cooperate fully with state authorities. But behind closed doors, the panic was visible. Multiple department heads were placed on administrative leave. HR called in third-party auditors. Griggs's name vanished from all staff directories. Bannister? Rumor was he'd stepped away to spend time with family. But the thing that surprised me most was the reaction from the people I used to walk past every day. Bethany, from marketing, posted on LinkedIn, "The quietest man in our hospital may have just saved it. We didn't see him, but he saw everything." Steven, the junior systems tech I had mentored, emailed me from his personal account. "Jake, they're all talking about you. Some are scared, some are grateful. Everyone is awake now." But it was a message from the hospital's chief of surgery that stopped me cold. "We reviewed old maintenance footage after your evidence surfaced. You fixed our oxygen delivery system during the blackout last year. Alone. Unasked. We never thanked you. I'm thanking you now. You likely saved lives, Mr. Wilson." My hands trembled slightly as I closed the message. I'd gone from invisible to indispensable. But not because I demanded recognition, because I insisted on truth. Still, I wasn't finished. The story had triggered a wider review of statewide hospital compliance, and Dana hinted that other facilities were now under scrutiny. Chase Griggs was being investigated for similar misconduct at 2 other hospitals, both of which had received grants tied to inspection scores. And as for me, I wasn't returning to Rivergate. That chapter was done. But when Dana asked if she could reveal my identity in a follow-up article, if I wanted to step forward and be known as the man who pulled the thread, I surprised myself. I said yes. Not for glory, but for every janitor, night nurse, and cafeteria worker who goes unseen, who holds a place together while others take the credit.
The real irony wasn't in how quickly they fell, it was in how suddenly everyone started remembering my name. 3 days after Dana's article exploded across every medical news feed and LinkedIn thread, I received a call from the Texas Department of Health and Human Services. Not a voicemail, not a form letter, A direct call from Dr. Priya Anand, head of compliance investigations. "Mr. Wilson," she said, her tone brisk but respectful, "we read your contributions to the Rivergate investigation. I'd like to speak with you about a role." At first, I thought she meant an interview, maybe a consultation gig. I was wrong. They wanted me to help oversee statewide compliance operations, not just as an advisor, but as regional compliance director. The very systems that once ignored me now wanted me to safeguard them. "You'll report directly to the Office of Patient Safety," she said. "You'll build new protocols, train audit teams, and most importantly, you'll be the one person in every room who knows what not to overlook." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I asked for a day to think. That night, I sat on the back porch, Scout curled up at my feet, watching the moon rise over the creek. Andrea brought out 2 mugs of tea and sat beside me. "Are you going to say yes?" she asked. I hesitated, not because of the workload or the title, but because part of me still lived in that boiler room at Rivergate, still remembered what it felt like to be invisible. "I used to think all I wanted was to do my job well and go home," I said quietly. "But maybe that was never enough." Andrea reached over and took my hand. "Maybe it was, for then, but now, maybe it's your turn to teach the system how to see people like you." I accepted the position the next morning. From that point on, everything moved fast. Dana ran a follow-up article, this time naming me, the janitor who cleaned up corruption, Jake Wilson's new role in health oversight. The comments flooded in. Hospital workers from Lubbock, Denton, El Paso, even Louisiana and Arkansas. People wrote stories of their own, times they tried to speak up and were silenced, times they saw things but weren't believed. My inbox became a support group, a bulletin board, a sounding post for 1,000 quiet voices. And then came the letters. One from a pediatric nurse in Austin who had worked in a hospital Griggs had once inspected. She thanked me for restoring her faith in the system. Another from a father whose infant son had spent 3 weeks in Rivergate's ICU. "You didn't just expose lies," he wrote. "You may have saved lives." I didn't reply to every message. I couldn't. But I printed the ones that mattered most and kept them in a folder marked Truth, a reminder of what one voice could spark. At the department, things were different. For the first time in my life, I had a team that looked to me for decisions. I walked into meetings where the chairs weren't reserved for suits with titles, but for people who asked hard questions and waited for real answers. I helped rewrite inspection standards. I implemented anonymous reporting procedures for maintenance and janitorial staff. I made sure every person in a uniform had a voice that counted. And still, I didn't let the title go to my head. I visited hospitals in person, walked through loading bays and utility closets, talked to night crews, asked them about outdated circuit breakers, broken alarms, mislabeled oxygen valves. And when they hesitated, unsure if I was just another suit, I told them the story. My story. The one where the man who held the mop also held the evidence that toppled 3 careers and forced a system to change. They always listened after that. Sometimes I'd catch a look, recognition, gratitude, maybe a little disbelief. But I never stayed long. I had work to do, and it was never about me. Months passed. Then one day, at a hospital in Galveston, a young maintenance worker followed me out to the parking lot after a tour. "Sir," he said, breathless, "you don't know me, but I read the article. You made me feel like what I do matters." I paused, then shook his hand. "It does. More than most people will ever understand." And maybe that was the point all along. Not just to expose a broken system, but to rebuild it with people who'd been ignored too long.
I never set out to dismantle a system. I just wanted my job back, or at least some acknowledgement that what I did mattered. But what I found on this path was far greater than reinstatement or recognition. I uncovered a truth that reached beyond my story, a truth that echoed through the lives of every overlooked janitor, every IT technician dismissed as too old school, every woman passed over for promotion because she didn't speak loudly enough. People like me, like us, weren't just background noise. We were the foundation. And when that foundation cracked, everything above it shook. In part 1, they tried to erase my name. In part 2, I discovered the rot behind the walls. In part 3, I exposed it with precision and calm. In part 4, I helped rebuild a better structure, one where people at the edges now had seats at the center. The greatest victory wasn't the downfall of the corrupt. It was the rise of those who were once silenced. It's easy to let bitterness fester when you've been betrayed. But justice, real justice, isn't about destruction. It's about illumination, about showing the world what happens when quiet strength meets cold facts and refuses to back down. Now, I walk hospital corridors not with a mop, but with purpose. Not because I abandoned who I was, but because I embraced the full weight of what that role meant. It taught me detail, patience, presence. It gave me insight no MBA could ever replicate. And when younger workers pass by and say, "Sir, I read your story," I nod and reply, "Then you already know. No role is too small to change everything." If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of someone you know, leave a comment below. Subscribe for more real stories of strength, redemption, and quiet heroes who refuse to disappear. Together, we'll make sure they're seen.